The house had learned to breathe like its master, slow, deliberate, and threatening. Every creak in the floorboards carried a warning. Every clock tick announced the seconds of her captivity. Anna had spent years memorizing those sounds so she could survive inside them. Tonight they sounded different, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make a mistake. She moved through the darkness without turning on a single light. Her bare feet glided across the cold tiles. Her body knew the route by memory. The rain outside lashed against the windows, heavy and relentless, masking the faint noises she made as she packed. She had left her suitcase in the hallway weeks ago, hidden behind the coat stand, a small act of rebellion that went unnoticed by the man upstairs. Her husband, Daniel, was asleep, or drunk enough to mimic it. The two states had become the same over the years. The storm outside would keep him under longer than usual. He hated the sound of rain because it reminded him of the night his father died. She had learned that detail in the early days, when he still told her stories about his childhood as if confession were intimacy. Back then she had believed him capable of tenderness. Back then she hadn't understood that his truths were weapons he stored for later. She folded the few things that still felt like hers. A sweater her mother had knitted before the wedding, a photograph of her sister, the small ring he once gave her before promises began to rot. Everything else in the house bore his mark. Clothes he approved, perfumes he chose, colors he said made her look obedient. The first time he raised his voice, she had cried. The first time he raised his hand, she had apologized. Somewhere between the two, love had been replaced by habit and fear. He didn't need to shout anymore. Control had become silence. His favorite kind of violence. He measured her life in permissions. Which friends she could call, what hours she could leave the house, how she dressed when they attended his clients' dinners. The punishments were never loud. They were surgical. He would remove her from the world piece by piece until she barely existed. He once took away her car keys for 3 months because she laughed too freely with a waiter. Another time he shredded the manuscript she had been writing for a year, saying stories were for people who didn't have real work to do. Tonight was different. The decision to leave had not come from courage but from exhaustion. It had taken one final act of cruelty to push her over the edge. A single slap, not harder than the others, but given in front of someone. His business partner's wife, who looked at Anna with pity instead of surprise. That pity had burned hotter than pain. In that moment Anna saw herself from the outside, small and voiceless, and she knew she could no longer stand inside her own life. She had waited until his breathing upstairs grew slow and uneven. Then she dressed in jeans and a gray hoodie, clothes that didn't belong to any version of the woman he had curated. The air smelled of whiskey and expensive cologne. Somewhere a pipe hummed in the walls, the refrigerator clicked. Thunder rolled above the roof. Her phone buzzed softly on the counter, the message from the driver she'd ordered hours ago under a false name. The notification glowed. "Your ride has arrived." Her fingers trembled as she zipped the small backpack. She took one last look at the framed photographs on the wall. Their wedding, their vacations, the carefully staged happiness. In every picture he was slightly turned toward her while she looked toward the camera, a quiet record of who had been seen and who had been owned. She turned the frames face down. The front door handle felt cold and foreign, like an object stolen from another life. She eased it open. The hinge moaned and she froze. No sound from upstairs. She stepped into the rain. The storm swallowed her immediately. Water soaked her hood, blurred the world into streaks of silver and black. The driveway shimmered under the streetlight. A car waited near the curb, engine idling, wipers cutting rhythmic lines across the windshield. She hesitated long enough to feel the weight of what she was doing settle into her chest. Then she walked forward. The driver didn't look at her when she opened the door. Only the dim glow of the dashboard painted the side of his face. Strong, calm, unreadable. She caught the trace of a scar near his jaw before the shadow reclaimed it. His hands rested on the wheel with the stillness of someone who knew exactly how much control power required. She slid into the back seat and closed the door. The sound of the lock felt final. He spoke without turning around. His voice was low, gravel rubbed smooth. He told her to buckle up. She did, the click loud in the confined space. He asked for the destination. She told him to drive anywhere but here. The windshield blurred the world into motion. The car eased away from the curb, and the house she had called home receded into darkness. For a long time neither of them said anything. The only voices were the rain and the engine. She watched the city drift past in a haze of wet light, neon reflected in puddles, traffic lights bending through water. The farther they went, the quieter it became. The city thinned, giving way to open roads lined with skeletal trees. She thought about turning around, about running back before Daniel noticed she was gone. He would wake, find the empty bed, and the cycle would begin again. Apologies, promises, surveillance disguised as love. But she couldn't. Even if she returned, something inside her had already crossed a point of no return. Her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Then another. Messages piling faster now. The first ones were questions, then accusations. She turned the device face down on her lap, unable to look. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror for the first time. His eyes were dark, reflective, patient. He said quietly that she should silence the phone. Its light could be seen from outside. She obeyed, noticing how his tone carried neither curiosity nor pity. Just awareness, like someone used to being hunted. She realized she hadn't even checked his name when she booked the ride. For all she knew, she had traded one danger for another. But something about the precision in his movements, the way he handled the wheel, the way he scanned the road, felt less like threat and more like protection, though she couldn't have explained why. The rain thickened, turning the world into a tunnel of motion. They passed the last gas station on the outskirts of the city. A flickering sign cast brief flashes into the car. She caught her reflection in the window and barely recognized herself. Pale, eyes too wide, lips bloodless. The face of a woman who had finally done something irreversible. She wondered what the driver saw when he looked in the mirror. A frightened passenger, a burden, or a story he didn't want to know. He asked after a while if she was running from someone or toward something. His tone made it sound like an observation, not a question. She told him it didn't matter. He said it always did. The road narrowed into a ribbon of asphalt winding through the outskirts. The headlights reached only a few meters ahead before dissolving into rain. She could feel the car's engine vibrating through the seat, steady and alive, the only thing between her and the dark that pressed against the windows. She caught herself counting the seconds between the wiper swings. It was easier than thinking about Daniel. But thoughts of him came anyway, drawn to the silence like insects to light. He hadn't always been cruel. The first year of their marriage had felt almost tender. He sent flowers to her office, cooked on Sundays, kissed her wrist when he passed behind her chair. It took time to notice the pattern, that every act of affection followed some moment where she had pulled slightly away. Love was how he reeled her back in. She could still remember the night he changed. They were at a company party, the kind where people smiled too much and talked about investments. She had laughed at something the young accountant said, and when she turned, Daniel was watching her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Later in the car, he drove in silence until she tried to fill it. He told her she embarrassed him. He said she didn't understand how fragile respect could be in his world. Then he grabbed her wrist, hard enough to leave a bruise, and told her never to forget who made her life possible. After that, he didn't need to repeat it often. The house itself learned to remind her. She flinched at a sudden flash of lightning. The memory dissolved. The driver's voice reached her again, calm against the rain. He told her to check the side mirror. A dark SUV had appeared behind them, its lights dimmed but not off. Her stomach clenched. Maybe it was just another traveler, but the rhythm of its movement matched theirs. The driver slowed slightly. The SUV slowed too. He muttered something under his breath, more to himself than to her, and took a right turn onto a smaller road. The SUV followed for a moment, then vanished behind the curtain of rain. He told her to relax. She wanted to believe him. They drove for what felt like hours. The city disappeared entirely, replaced by open fields and skeletal barns. She realized she hadn't asked his name. He hadn't asked for hers either. There was something comfortable about that absence. An agreement that neither wanted to belong to the world for a while. When they finally stopped, it was at a small roadside cafe that looked closed. The driver stepped out without speaking. His movements quick and controlled. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had done dangerous things before. Through the fogged glass she watched him check the lot. One glance toward the road, another toward the woods, the kind of scan soldiers or criminals made. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead. For a moment she wondered if she should be afraid of him too, when he came back. He handed her a paper cup. The coffee inside was bitter and too hot, but it steadied her hands. He said they'd drive until morning. She nodded, grateful for the decision she didn't have to make back in the car. He told her that the roads ahead would split, one toward the coast, one deeper inland. He said the inland road was safer. She asked why, and he simply said that the sea had too many eyes. Her phone buzzed again. The sound was tiny but sharp in the enclosed space. This time she looked. The messages had turned into threats. You think you can run? I know every friend you have. She could almost hear his voice inside the words. She deleted them one by one. But the fear stayed. The driver asked quietly if she had somewhere she could go. She said no. He said that helped. People without destinations were harder to track. She studied his reflection in the window. There was something about his calm that frightened her more than Daniel's rage ever had. Rage she understood. Calm like this came from another world. He noticed her stare. He said it wasn't a good night to be out alone, and that she should try to rest. She leaned against the cold window and closed her eyes, pretending to sleep. Her thoughts drifted backward again, to the first time Daniel had said he loved her. It was after she'd told him about her father's drinking, about the nights she used to hide with her sister under the table. Daniel had kissed her hair and said he'd never let her feel unsafe again. At the time it had sounded like a promise. Later she realized it was a claim. The car slowed suddenly. Her eyes opened. They were approaching a fuel station surrounded by nothing but dark fields. The sign flickered. A single truck was parked near the pumps. The driver told her he'd refill and that she should stay inside. He stepped out. She watched him through the rain-streaked glass as he spoke briefly to a man near the truck. She couldn't hear them, but she saw the other man smile too easily. The driver's shoulders stiffened. The exchange lasted seconds. Then he paid for the fuel and walked back. When he opened the door, the air that followed him and smelled of cigarettes and metal. He told her quietly that they needed to leave now. She asked what was wrong. He said only that someone was watching them. He turned off the headlights and reversed out of the station using only the faint red glow of the taillights. Then he accelerated down a side road so narrow the branches brushed the car's roof. The rain made it impossible to see where they were going. Her heart pounded. She asked if it was Daniel's men. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer, almost tired. He said that whoever they weren't hers. She didn't know what that meant, but something in his tone told her not to ask. They drove until the road disappeared into gravel. An old building loomed ahead. An auto shop long abandoned. The driver killed the engine. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of rain on metal and both of their breathing. He told her to stay inside, then stepped out into the dark. Through the windshield she saw him walk toward a shadow at the edge of the building. Another man stepped forward to meet him. Their gestures were sharp, controlled. Even from a distance she could feel the current of threat between them. When the other man lit a cigarette, the flash revealed a face covered in tattoos and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. She thought about opening the door and running into the night. But where would she go? The driver said something low. The other man answered with laughter that sounded like a promise of trouble. Then the driver turned his head slightly toward the car, just enough for her to see his expression. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. In that moment, she realized he wasn't a man who stumbled into danger. He was the kind who carried it with him. Inside the car, the air grew thick with tension. Anna's pulse thudded in her ears, the sound almost drowning the rain. Through the windshield she could see the two men, silhouettes cut out of the storm, one tall and still, the other shifting his weight like a predator testing its ground. Their voices were too faint to hear, but she could read fragments in their movements. The small jerk of the driver's chin, the mocking tilt of the other man's head, the short sharp gesture that could have meant a warning or a goodbye. The cigarette's ember flared, fell, and died. The driver returned to the car. His wet hair clung to his forehead. Water glistened on the line of his jaw. He didn't speak until he was inside. Engine silent, rain hammering on the roof. Then quietly he said the name Marco. It was half explanation, half curse. He told her to fasten her belt. They drove again, wheels sliding on the slick gravel until the tires caught the road. She didn't ask what had just happened. His silence made questions dangerous. She only knew that whatever he had been before this night was catching up with him, and that she had somehow stepped into its path. The headlights carved tunnels through the rain. He took another narrow road, one she hadn't seen on the map. When she finally found the courage to speak, her voice sounded small. She asked who he really was. He said that names were just ghosts people carried. She asked what that meant. He told her it meant he'd had too many. She didn't press further. She didn't want to know yet. The road climbed into a stretch of hills. Trees leaned inward as if to listen. The driver seemed to know every bend, slowing just enough before each curve, eyes flicking constantly between the mirrors and the dark ahead. She realized that he wasn't driving randomly. He was following a pattern, a series of turns designed to lose someone. When he finally stopped, the rain had softened to a mist. They were in front of an old church whose bell tower leaned slightly to one side. It looked abandoned, yet a faint orange light glowed through one of the windows. He told her they'd stay here until morning. She hesitated before stepping out. The ground was slick, and her shoes sank into mud. The driver walked ahead, pushing open the wooden door with his shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of wax and old stone. Dozens of candles flickered near the altar. An old man appeared from a side door, startled. He wore the collar of a priest and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. When he looked at the driver, his expression changed from fear to something closer to disbelief. He said a word she didn't understand, Italian maybe, but it carried a tremor of familiarity. The driver's reply was quiet, respectful, almost guilty. The old man reached out a shaking hand and touched the side of his face like a father confirming that a son still breathed. Anna stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a reunion she couldn't comprehend. The priest's voice softened. He said they could rest in the back rooms. The driver thanked him. She caught the way his shoulders eased, if only slightly, at the offered end, the small chamber behind the altar. She sat on a wooden bench while the driver checked the door's locks. He moved with methodical precision, testing each latch, inspecting the small window above the sink. When he was satisfied, he finally looked at her. He said she should sleep. She asked if he ever did. He smiled faintly without humor and said that men who once learned to sleep lightly never forgot how. She wanted to ask who had taught him that, but instead she asked why he helped her. He said because she looked like someone who hadn't yet given up believing that the world could be better than it was. The words stayed with her long after he left the room. She tried to sleep on the narrow cot, but her body refused. The storm outside had faded into a soft drizzle, yet her mind echoed with the memory of Daniel's voice. His threats, his promises. She imagined him waking, realizing she was gone. She could almost see the rage spreading through him, the frantic calls to his contacts, the orders to find her. She turned her face into the pillow and tried to breathe. The air smelled of dust and candle smoke. Somewhere nearby, she could hear the murmur of the driver and the priest speaking in low Italian. The words flowed like water, rhythmic and sorrowful. She drifted in and out of shallow dreams. Daniel at the doorway holding her wrist, the driver's scar glinting in headlights, the endless road. When she woke again, the candles had burned down to pools of wax. The driver was sitting near the door, cleaning something small and metallic with a rag. She realized, with a shock that didn't fully register as fear, that it was a gun. He noticed her gaze. He told her it was only a precaution. She asked if they were in danger. He said danger didn't disappear, It only changed shape. The priest entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. His eyes lingered on the weapon before he set the cups down. He told the driver that some ghosts never stopped knocking. The driver answered that he was tired of pretending not to hear them. Anna watched the exchange without understanding, but the emotion between them felt heavy enough to fill the room. The priest turned to her then, offering a small smile. He said she was safe here. She wanted to believe him, but safety had become a foreign language. After breakfast, the driver said they would leave before sunrise. The priest tried to dissuade him, saying the roads were not safe, but the decision was already made. As they stepped outside, the world was wrapped in fog. The driver paused to light a cigarette, his hand steady. The priest touched his arm once more and whispered something that sounded like a blessing or a warning. They began to walk toward the car, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. Anna looked back at the church and saw the priest standing in the doorway, framed by candlelight, his face drawn and solemn. She wondered how many goodbyes that man had spoken in his life. The driver started the engine. The tires crunched over gravel. She looked at him and asked if the priest had called him son. He said yes. She asked if it was true. He said blood wasn't always the only way to belong. They drove on. The fog thickened until the world disappeared again. She thought she saw movement in the trees, a flash of something metallic, but when she turned her head it was gone. Few minutes later, the sound came, distant at first, then unmistakable. Engines. More than one. The driver's posture changed instantly, his eyes cutting to the mirror. He told her to keep her head down. She ducked as lights flared behind them, sharp through the mist. 3 vehicles moving fast. He pressed the accelerator. The car leapt forward. Mud sprayed behind them. The chase began quietly, almost elegantly. 2 machines pushing against the limits of the wet road. He handled the wheel with calm precision, spinning through turns that should have been impossible. The lights behind them wavered, then steadied again. He told her that if he told her to run, she shouldn't look back. She nodded, throat too tight for words. Bullets wouldn't come yet. This was a test, a warning. Whoever followed them wanted to be sure first. They reached the old bridge that cut across the valley. The boards rattled under their weight. The other cars slowed, unwilling to risk the structure. When they reached the other side, he turned abruptly onto a dirt road that descended toward the coast. The sea appeared below them, black and infinite. He stopped near an abandoned shack overlooking the waves. He turned off the headlights and sat in silence, hands still on the wheel. She could see the tremor in them now, faint but real. He said quietly that Marco had found him. She asked who Marco was. He said someone who once should have been family. She asked what he wanted. He said forgiveness was never part of their world. She didn't ask anything else. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The wind outside carried the smell of salt and rain. She thought of the house she had left, of Daniel waking alone, of the photograph frames turned face down. She thought she should feel free, but what she felt instead was suspended. Between lives, between truths, between men who each, in their own way, had learned how to own silence. The driver opened his eyes. He said they'd rest for an hour and then move again. She nodded, but she knew neither of them would sleep. The car rocked gently as wind swept in from the sea, whispering through cracks in the old shack's boards. The faint smell of rust and wet salt filled the air. Anna sat against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to find warmth in her own body. The driver, Dante, though she didn't yet know that name, leaned near the doorway, his outline sharp against the dim gray outside. He moved with that same quiet alertness, the kind that made her think of soldiers she'd seen in old documentaries, men who never fully returned from whatever place had trained them to listen for death. He told her softly that he hadn't meant for her to get caught in his mess. She said she'd already been living in a different kind of mess long before tonight. He turned his head, and in the half-light she could see the faintest trace of something like respect in his eyes, when the first hint of morning crept over the horizon. He stepped out to check the road. She followed him, her shoes sinking into wet sand. The tide hissed quietly along the shore. He told her they'd need to move before daylight fully came. She asked why, and he said the kind of men they were running from didn't sleep when money or blood was involved. They got back into the car. The world brightened in slow motion. Gray sky, pale water, the kind of morning that should have promised peace but didn't. The radio crackled with static. He switched it off and drove inland again, taking narrow lanes that seemed to exist only for them. After a while she asked if he'd always lived this way, running, watching. He said it wasn't living, it was paying debts. She asked to whom. He said to himself first, and then to the ghosts he'd made along the way. She thought about that for a long time. There were ghosts in her life too, but they were all versions of herself she hadn't been brave enough to be. By midday they reached a cluster of old stone buildings near a field overrun with weeds. The driver parked behind a shed. He stepped out, scanned the horizon, then motioned for her to follow. Inside the shed, the air smelled of gasoline and damp wood. He opened a metal locker and pulled out a small bag. Money, clothes, a passport. She realized he must have been planning this hideout long before tonight. He noticed her watching. He told her everyone needed a place to disappear. She asked if he had ever managed to disappear completely. He said not yet. They left the shed and followed a path that led to a farmhouse hidden behind trees. The place looked as if it hadn't been lived in for years. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. Dust swirled in the thin shafts of light. She helped him gather dry wood from the corner, and soon they had a small fire in the old hearth. Its warmth painted their faces gold. He said they would wait there until night. She sat near the fire, letting the heat sink into her bones. She hadn't felt warmth that wasn't tainted by fear in years. As the day drifted toward afternoon, the quiet settled deeper. She studied him, the deliberate way he cleaned the gun again, the precision of every movement. She asked if he had ever killed anyone. He looked at her for a long time before answering that sometimes surviving meant the same thing. She didn't know whether to be afraid or sorry for him. Maybe both. Outside, the rain began again. Softer now, more like memory than storm. She told him about Daniel for the first time. Not all at once, but in fragments. The control, the isolation, the way he'd chipped away at her until she doubted her own reflection. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said quietly that men like Daniel were built from the same metal as men like him, only shaped differently. He said one used power for greed, the other for survival. She asked which one he was. He said he hadn't decided yet. Evening fell. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows against the walls. She found herself watching the play of light across his face, how it softened the hardness there. He caught her looking and told her to rest. She lay down on the old couch, eyes half closed, and listened to the rhythm of rain against the roof. Sleep came in pieces. Each time she drifted off, she saw Daniel's eyes, the moment of his last slap, the pity in that other woman's face. Then the dream shifted and she saw the driver's scar instead, sharp and silver in the dark. She woke suddenly when the car alarm chirped outside. He was already at the window, gun in hand. The sound had stopped as quickly as it came, replaced by the hiss of rain. He told her to stay low. She did. Minutes stretched. Nothing happened. Then headlights flared briefly through the trees and vanished. He exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders. He said they'd been found sooner than he'd hoped. She asked what that meant. He said it meant they'd run again before the moon rose. He poured water over the fire and slung the small bag across his shoulder. They stepped into the rain. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches heavy with water, mud slick beneath their shoes. The road was empty when they reached it. He said they'd need another car soon. The one they had might be tracked. She asked how he knew. He said experience taught him that every machine eventually told on you. They walked for nearly an hour before finding a second-hand lot on the edge of a town. He broke the lock on a small hatchback with practiced efficiency. She asked if he worried about being caught. He said being caught was always part of the plan. The trick was choosing when. They drove again, silent, until the landscape flattened into open fields. The rain stopped completely, leaving the world washed and fragile. She looked at him and said she wanted to know his name. He hesitated, then told her, Dante. The name hung in the air like smoke. Familiar, dangerous, inevitable. She repeated it once under her breath, and he glanced at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. He told her that names came with history. She said so did scars. He smiled faintly and said maybe they were the same thing. Night approached once more. He said they'd reach the coast by midnight and find a boat there. She didn't ask where it would take them. It was enough to be moving, to feel the old life shrinking behind them with every mile they in the distance. Thunder rolled again, a low reminder that storms never really ended. They just moved further down the horizon, waiting to return. The sky ahead was the color of bruised steel, the last of the rain dragging veils across the windshield. Dante kept the headlights low, the tires whispering on the wet asphalt. Every few minutes he glanced at the rearview mirror, not because he expected a car there, but because habit ruled him more than fear ever had. Anna watched the reflection slide across his face. The road's pale light caught the edge of his scar, a narrow mark that seemed almost deliberate, like an artist's final stroke on an unfinished painting. She wondered how he'd earned it but didn't ask. She had learned that some questions invited ghosts. The farther they drove, the more the night seemed to lean in. The wind carried a smell of salt now. The sea was close, unseen but heavy in the air. Dante said they'd stop at a fishing village that no longer appeared on modern maps. There he knew someone who owed him a favor. She asked how he could trust anyone from his past. He told her that trust wasn't the same as faith. It was just the temporary suspension of doubt. The narrow road curved between cliffs. Below them the sea roared, dark, endless and cold. Anna's hand tightened around the seat belt as if that strip of fabric could tether her to safety. Dante noticed and slowed slightly. He said she should look at the waves instead of the drop. The waves were alive, and they were never afraid to fall. She tried. The water churned under the moonlight, restless, beautiful and terrifying. It reminded her of every choice she had ever made. Chaotic but necessary. A small cluster of lights appeared ahead. 3, maybe 4 houses crouched against the cliff's edge. Dante parked behind an old warehouse whose roof had partly collapsed. He told her to stay inside while he checked the pier. She watched him step into the mist and vanish. Minutes stretched. She counted them by the beat of her heart. When he finally returned, his jacket was damp, his hair glistening. He said the boats were gone. The sea had taken them weeks ago, or the owners had taken them somewhere safer. He lit a cigarette and stared at the water. She told him she didn't smoke. He said neither did he, but sometimes people needed to hold fire just to feel alive. They sat in silence. The storm had moved east, leaving the world strangely hollow. She wanted to ask where he'd come from. What kind of life built a man who carried weapons yet spoke like a poet? Instead she said she wasn't used to quiet. He told her quiet was only dangerous if you didn't know what to listen for. In the distance, a faint rumble rose. Not thunder this time, but engines. Dante dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He said they'd been traced. He opened the trunk and tossed her a small flashlight, told her to keep close and stay low. They ran toward the cliffs, the wet ground sliding underfoot. The first headlights swept across the village, slow and deliberate. They reached an old stairway carved into the rock that led down to a hidden cove. Dante motioned for her to descend first. The wind whipped her hood back, cold needles against her skin. She could hear voices above now, men calling in a language she didn't understand. At the bottom of the path stood a half-sunken boat chained to the rocks. Dante jumped in, cut the chain with a bolt cutter he'd pulled from his bag, and motioned for her to hold on. The small motor sputtered, coughed, then caught. The boat lurched away from the cliff. Behind them flashlights flared. Bullets cracked the air. Water splashed inches from the hull. Anna ducked instinctively. Dante steered them into the darkness, zigzagging through the waves. The sea closed over their wake, swallowing sound. After a while the only thing she heard was wind and the rhythmic slap of water against wood. Dante kept his eyes fixed ahead. The moon cut a silver path over the water, guiding them toward a distant line of black that might have been another shore or just the promise of one. He said quietly that they'd have to find land before dawn. Fuel was low and the engine was old. She asked what would happen if it failed. He said then they'd drift, and sometimes drifting was safer than being found. She didn't reply. The salt stung her lips. She looked back once and saw nothing but horizon. No lights, no pursuit, only the echo of what they'd escaped. For the first time since she'd left Daniel's house, she felt a hint of something like peace. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was its shadow. Dante noticed her shoulders easing. He told her not to trust calm seas. They lied better than storms. The sea stretched endlessly, a cold sheet of ink broken only by the sound of the motor. Dawn began to form at the edge of the horizon, washing the sky in bruised violet. Anna pulled her hoodie tighter around her, but the wind still bit through the fabric. Dante guided the boat with the same careful confidence he used for everything else. Every movement was precise, balanced between control and instinct. She found herself studying him the way one might study a storm from the safety of a window, aware that it was dangerous, yet unable to look away. He told her they'd find an inlet ahead, a stretch of rocks that led into an abandoned marina. From there, they could hide the boat and move inland again. She asked why they kept running instead of stopping. He said that stopping was how people like them got found. The word them lingered in her thoughts. She didn't know if he meant fugitives, survivors, or something in between. The sun began to rise. The sea turned from black to silver. She could see his face more clearly now, the sharp line of his jaw, the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm. He looked like someone who had learned to live inside his own armor. When the shoreline appeared, it was nothing more than a series of broken docks and ruined warehouses. Dante steered into the shallows, cut the engine, and let the boat drift until it touched the sand with a soft scrape. He jumped out first, then offered her his hand. The moment their palms met, something passed between them, an understanding brief and unspoken. She didn't know whether it was trust or the beginning of something more dangerous. They pulled the boat onto the beach, covered it with a torn tarp, and walked toward the warehouses. The air smelled of salt and rust, and gulls cried overhead like echoes of forgotten voices. Inside the first warehouse, sunlight pierced the broken roof in narrow shafts. Dust floated in the light like small, tired stars. Dante checked the corners, moving silently, every step deliberate. Satisfied that they were alone, he told her they could rest for a few hours. Anna sat on a crate, watching him pace. She said he never seemed to stop moving. He said movement kept him alive. He took off his jacket, revealing the faint outline of a tattoo just above his shoulder blade, an emblem of something she couldn't quite make out. He caught her gaze and said that some marks couldn't be washed away no matter how far one ran. She said she knew what that felt like. He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt stripped bare under his eyes. The silence between them thickened until it became almost intimate. Then he turned away, breaking it. He said they should leave before noon. She wanted to protest, to ask for a moment longer to rest, but something in his tone told her this wasn't the kind of life where rest existed. They walked along the cracked road that led away from the docks. The sun climbed higher, turning the metal debris into mirrors that flashed blinding light. The town they entered was small, built around a single main street lined with shuttered shops. Dante guided her into a diner with a flickering sign. Inside, the smell of stale coffee mixed with grease. A woman behind the counter looked up, her expression flat. Dante ordered 2 coffees and a plate of whatever was left from breakfast. Anna ate slowly, every sound, the clink of cups, the distant hum of a refrigerator, feeling unnaturally loud after so much silence. Dante watched the street through the window, his hand never far from the inside of his jacket. She asked how he knew they hadn't been followed. He said he didn't. He just knew how to listen after they ate. He left money on the table and told her they'd head north. She asked what waited there. He said answers, maybe redemption. They reached the edge of town where an old road cut into a forest. Trees closed above them, turning the sunlight into scattered gold. For a while they walked without speaking. The world felt distant, suspended. She thought of Daniel again, how he would be raging, how easily rage had once seemed powerful. She realized suddenly that she no longer feared him. Fear had been replaced by something colder and sharper. Defiance. Dante noticed the change in her face. He said she looked like someone who had finally stopped apologizing. She said maybe she had. They found an abandoned cabin near a stream. The windows were cracked but the structure held. Inside, Dante searched for anything usable. Old blankets, a rusted lamp, a few tins of food that might still be edible. He told her they'd stay until night. He'd make a small fire outside. The smoke would be harder to trace among the trees. When he stepped out, she walked around the cabin, letting her fingers trail across the rough wood. She tried to imagine what life would look like if it ever stopped running. Through the window she watched him gather wood. His movements efficient, practiced. There was a steadiness in him that drew her in despite herself. For the first time she wondered what he looked like when he wasn't carrying the weight of his past. He returned with the fire lit, small and bright. He said they could cook the canned beans. It wasn't much, but it was something. They ate in silence again, but this time it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people who had nothing left to prove. When night came, the forest filled with a chorus of unseen insects. The fire's glow touched their faces with soft orange. He told her that years ago, before all of this, he had once believed in salvation, that there was always a way back. But the world had a habit of punishing people who believed too much. She asked if he still believed. He said he didn't know. She told him that maybe salvation wasn't a place you reached. Maybe it was a choice you made every day. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded slightly. He said maybe she was right. For a moment the distance between them dissolved. The sound of the stream, the fire, their breathing. It all merged into one rhythm. Then he stood and said he'd take first watch. She should sleep. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at her. She lay down near the fire, eyes half open. The last thing she saw was him sitting at the edge of the light, cigarette ember glowing like a heartbeat against the dark. And for the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of escape. The forest woke before she did. Birds moved in the upper branches, their wings cutting small shapes through mist. When Anna opened her eyes, the world was a blur of green and gold. For a moment she forgot where she was, and the peace of not remembering felt almost cruel. Dante was still awake. He sat near the ashes of the fire, a knife in one hand, shaving thin curls of wood from a fallen branch. The light caught in his eyes made them look colder, older. She asked if he'd slept at all. He said he hadn't needed to. She joined him, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. The night air still clung to her clothes. He handed her a tin cup filled with coffee he'd brewed from something bitter and black. It tasted of smoke and metal, but it was warm. They ate what remained of the beans. He said they'd move again before noon. The forest was safe only while it stayed quiet. He had seen fresh tire tracks on a service road not far from the stream. She asked if it could be hunters. He said maybe, but hunters didn't drive in pairs. As they packed, she watched him check his pistol. Magazine, safety, slide. All movements quick and silent. She realized how ritualistic it was, almost like prayer. The road through the forest wound uphill, and the morning fog thinned into long ribbons. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine. Anna's thoughts wandered to her sister, to the messages she had stopped sending years ago because Daniel read them first. She wondered what her sister would think now, if she'd be proud or terrified. Dante noticed her expression. He told her guilt was a kind of chain. Sometimes you had to cut it before it dragged you back under. She said she wasn't sure she was ready to. He answered that no one ever was. That's why it worked. By midday, the forest opened onto a valley. Far below, a stretch of river shimmered in the sun. Dante led her down a narrow slope to a wooden bridge that looked older than either of them. He tested the boards before crossing. Halfway across, the wood groaned under their weight, but it held on the other side. They followed a dirt path to a cluster of houses, a small mountain village that smelled of wood smoke and rain-soaked soil. A few people looked up as they passed. Farmers, children, a woman hanging laundry. Their gazes lingered on Dante longer than on her. He spoke briefly to a shopkeeper in Italian that rolled from his tongue like something remembered, not learned. The shopkeeper nodded, eyes wary. When they left, Anna asked what he'd said. Dante told her he'd asked for directions to the old road toward the monastery. She asked why a monastery. He said because it was the one place men like Marco never dared to enter. Even wolves avoided altars. They climbed again. The sky grew heavier, a promise of more rain. Dante's pace quickened as if urgency lived under his skin. He didn't explain and she didn't ask. She had begun to understand that silence was his truest language. When the first drops fell, they took shelter under a rocky overhang. The wind hissed through the trees. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Dante leaned against the stone, arms crossed. She asked if he'd ever had a home. He said he had once, long ago, before loyalty became a currency. He told her, almost absently, that he had been born near Naples, that his mother had died young, that his father had been a man who believed fear was respect. He'd left home at 15, chosen by men who promised brotherhood and gave him blood instead. Anna listened without interrupting. His voice was steady, but beneath it she could hear the ache of memory, like a song played on broken strings. He said the priest they'd met, Father Luca, had been the only one who ever tried to pull him out. He failed, but he kept trying until the family burned his church. Dante had saved him then, but saving a man didn't erase the ashes. The rain thickened, turning the rock face into a sheet of water. Dante said they'd wait it out. The sound would cover their tracks. She asked if Marco had been part of that same family. He nodded once. He said Marco had been his brother in everything but blood, until greed split them apart. She wanted to know more, to fill the silence with questions, but he looked away, and she understood that this was as much as he could give. When the rain eased, they continued toward the ridge. Clouds rolled low, heavy as smoke. The road turned from dirt to gravel, then to cracked asphalt. At the top stood an archway of stone, carved with Latin words she couldn't read. Beyond it, a path wound down toward the ruins of what had once been the monastery. The place looked abandoned, but the air carried the faint sound of a bell. Slow and deliberate, Dante stopped. His shoulders stiffened. He said someone was there. Anna's breath caught. She asked if it was Marco. Dante said no, but whoever it was, they were expecting him. The bell rang again, slow and hollow, fading into the valley below. Dante scanned the path ahead, eyes narrowing as if each sound carried a memory. The ruins of the monastery rose out of the mist, arched windows broken like ribs, vines crawling over stone, pieces of roof sagging under years of neglect. Yet candlelight flickered faintly behind one shattered window, proof that something, or someone, still lived here. He told Anna to stay behind him and keep her head low. His tone left no space for argument. She followed quietly, heart thudding in her chest. The closer they moved toward the monastery, the colder the air became. It wasn't just the mountain chill. It was the stillness that wrapped around abandoned places, the kind that seemed to wait for footsteps. At the gate, a figure appeared. A man in a dark coat stood beside the crumbling arch, cigarette ember glowing between his fingers. He raised his hand slowly, not in greeting but in warning. Dante stopped. The man spoke in Italian, his voice low and rough like gravel. Dante answered in the same tongue, each word short, clipped, deliberate. Anna couldn't understand the exchange, but she recognized tone, the way distrust and familiarity could exist in the same breath. After a moment, the man turned and motioned for them to follow. Inside the monastery grounds, life still lingered in small details. A kettle on a makeshift fire, a rope strung with drying clothes, the smell of old incense clinging to wet stone. The stranger led them into what had once been the sanctuary. Another man waited there, older, face lined like folded paper, his hands scarred and steady. He looked at Dante with something between recognition and sorrow. He said, in English this time, that the dead were quieter company than the living. Dante answered that sometimes silence was safer than forgiveness. The older man smiled without humor. He called Dante by name. Anna felt the name like a spark. Finally hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight. Dante didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. He asked if Marco had come through. The older man nodded once. He said Marco had been looking for him, offering money and mercy in the same breath, though everyone knew mercy from men like Marco always came with a knife. Dante asked how far behind. The old man said not far enough. Anna tried to make sense of it all, but their words moved too fast, too layered. All she could gather was that Marco was closer than either of them wanted to admit. The old man offered them a room, small and windowless. Dante accepted, though she could see tension in every muscle. Once inside, he bolted the door and leaned against it, head bowed. She told him he could rest for a while. He said rest was a luxury for people who didn't have shadows. She asked about Marco again. He said Marco used to be the kind of man who could make you believe loyalty was love. But greed had turned him into something else. He paused, as if debating whether to continue. Then he said that years ago, when the family fractured, Marco had sold Dante's name to the highest bidder, a rival who'd wanted the Don dead. The ambush that followed had killed half of Dante's men. Everyone had thought him among them. It was how he'd disappeared, how he'd become a ghost with a driver's license instead of a crown. Anna listened, barely breathing. The idea that the quiet man before her had once ruled over that kind of world felt surreal. But something in his bearing, the way he commanded stillness, made it easy to believe. He said softly that he hadn't wanted to come back, that ghosts weren't meant to walk again. But Marco had made that impossible. The sound of the bell echoed once more through the stone halls, closer this time. Dante straightened. He told her to pack what little they had. She asked where they'd go next. He said somewhere the dead wouldn't think to look. They slipped out through a side corridor, their footsteps barely whispering against the floor. The old man from before was gone. Only the faint smell of tobacco remained, outside. Fog had swallowed the valley completely. Dante led her along a path that wound behind the monastery, descending toward the forest. He moved fast, scanning the shadows for movement. Anna followed as best she could, her lungs burning from the cold air. Dante returned fire twice, the muzzle flash brief and blinding. He told Anna to stay down. She pressed herself against the stone, trembling when the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Dante waited, counting breaths. Then he grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the woods. They moved downhill until the sounds of pursuit faded into distance. They didn't stop until they reached a river at the forest's edge. Dante crouched beside the water, wiping mud from his hands. He said they'd follow the current west. It would wash away their scent and tracks. Anna nodded. Too breathless to speak, they walked along the riverbank for what felt like hours. The forest gradually opened into flat land, and ahead she could see the faint lights of another town. Small, remote, but alive. Dante said they'd reach it by midnight. They'd find new clothes, a new car, and maybe, if the night was kind, a few hours to breathe. As they approached the outskirts, Anna thought about how the world had changed in just 2 days. She'd gone from being a prisoner in a marriage to a fugitive beside a man whose name carried death and salvation in equal measure. And though fear still burned inside her, there was something else beneath it now. Something dangerous, something almost like faith. The town slept under a shroud of mist. Street lamps glowed through it like half-remembered stars. Dante parked the stolen car on the far edge of the main road, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence felt fragile, as though one wrong breath might wake the world. He told Anna to stay low while he checked the street. A cat darted from a pile of crates, scattering rainwater. Somewhere a church bell struck one, a slow metallic heartbeat. No engines, no footsteps. For the first time since the monastery, the night belonged to them. They crossed the road and entered a narrow alley lined with shuttered windows. A flickering sign above one door read Pensione Luca. The building looked as though it had survived wars by learning how to disappear. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cheap soap. That a woman in her 60s sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. She barely looked up when Dante asked for a room. His Italian was smoother now, almost tender. The woman nodded and handed him a key. No questions, no curiosity. just the instinctive discretion of people who'd seen too much. The room was small. A bed, a single chair, a window overlooking the street. The sheets smelled faintly of lemon and rain. Dante checked the locks twice before allowing himself to breathe. Anna stood by the window, watching the fog swirl around the streetlights. She said it felt unreal, like they'd slipped between worlds. He told her that was exactly what running did. It blurred the borders until you couldn't tell where one life ended and another began. He took off his jacket, revealing a fresh cut along his arm. She moved toward him before thinking, tore a strip from her sleeve, and pressed it against the wound. He didn't flinch. The moment stretched, her fingers brushing his skin. His breath steady but deeper now. He told her softly that she didn't have to fix what the world broke. She said maybe she just didn't want more blood on her hands. He let her finish bandaging, then stepped back. The distance between them returned, thin but deliberate. She asked what would happen if Marco found them again. Dante said then the story would end the same way it always did. For men like him, endings were never rewritten, only delayed. He lay down on the bed, boots still on, and told her to rest. She sat in the chair instead, watching the fog outside until her eyes burned. When morning came, the world smelled of coffee and wet pavement. The pensione owner knocked once, left a tray of bread and fruit, and vanished. Dante checked the window before touching the food. Habit again, they ate quickly. Anna asked where they'd go next. He said north, always north, until they reached a place where even maps stopped caring. By noon they were back on the road, a different car under them, the pensione shrinking in the mirror. Fields rolled past, green stitched with wildflowers. For a few miles, the world looked almost innocent. Dante loosened his grip on the wheel. He told her the family he'd once belonged to had controlled half the ports along the southern coast. They'd moved more than goods, they'd moved power. He said Marco had wanted it all, and when he couldn't take it cleanly, he'd taken it in blood. Anna listened. She asked if Dante had ever killed for that power. He didn't answer right away. Then he said yes, but the first time it felt like justice, the second like duty, and every time after that like decay. The honesty in his tone chilled her more than denial would have. She told him he could still change. He said people didn't change, they just ran out of choices. They drove for hours without speaking. The sun began to sink, turning the sky into streaks of orange and violet. She leaned her head against the window, watching reflections of his profile flash and vanish with each passing light. When the gas gauge dipped low, he pulled into a roadside station. A teenage attendant filled the tank while Dante scanned the horizon. The boy asked if they were heading to the mountains. Dante said maybe. The boy laughed and said the mountains were for ghosts. Dante smiled faintly and said that was exactly why they were going there. Back in the car, the road narrowed again, cutting through stretches of pine and shadow. Night returned with sudden violence, swallowing color. Anna dozed off for a while. In her half-sleep she dreamed of Daniel's voice turning into the sound of waves, of Dante standing in the surf, faceless, unreachable. She woke when the car jolted over gravel. They had left the main road. Ahead lay a row of derelict buildings and a sign so rusted the letters were unreadable. Dante said they'd stop here for a while. The place had once been a motel, maybe for travelers who believed the world was still small enough to cross in a day. Now it was a skeleton of paint and glass. He found a room with a door that still locked, told her to rest while he checked the perimeter. When he returned, he said they weren't followed. For tonight at least, they were ghosts again. He sat by the window, pistol on his knee, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. She lay on the bed, exhaustion tugging her down. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was his voice, low and almost gentle, saying that storms had a way of finding those who thought they'd outrun them. The night stretched long and sleepless. Rain returned in thin sheets, whispering against the broken glass. Dante barely moved from his place by the window. The pistol lay across his thigh, hand resting lightly on the grip. His eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. Anna woke once, disoriented. The faint glow from a streetlight outside painted half his face in gold, half in shadow. He looked carved from the same stillness that filled the room. She asked softly if he ever got tired of watching. He said tiredness was a luxury for people who trusted sleep. She lay back down, listening to the rhythm of rain and the faint creak of the old building. For the first time she noticed that the fear inside her had changed shape. It was no longer the sharp panic of flight, but something slower, heavier, like a tide waiting to pull her somewhere she couldn't name. When dawn came, pale and cold, Dante was already moving. He packed their things with military precision, checked the hallway, and told her to move quietly. Outside, the air smelled of metal and wet asphalt. They slipped through the back door into the morning mist. A short walk brought them to the edge of town where a narrow rail line ran between fields. Dante said a freight train passed twice a day, carrying produce north. If they could board it, it would take them further than any road. They waited by the tracks, crouched behind a row of barrels. The earth trembled before the sound arrived. Then the train appeared, long and slow, grinding through fog. Dante grabbed the edge of a car, hauled himself up, then reached down for her hand. She took it without hesitation. The world blurred around them as they climbed aboard. Inside, the car smelled of wood and damp hay. They found a corner and sat close, knees almost touching. The rhythm of wheels on rails filled the silence between them. Anna said she'd never done anything like this before. Dante smiled faintly and said that made two of them. She laughed softly, surprised at the sound. It felt out of place and human in a life that had become nothing but flight. As the train moved through the countryside, she watched fields unroll like pages. Houses appeared and vanished. Smoke curled from chimneys. Somewhere children were probably waking for school, unaware of the two ghosts passing through their world. She asked if he ever thought about disappearing completely, changing his name, his face, living quietly. He said he had tried once, but the past was a jealous thing. It always came looking. They talked little after that. The train clattered north, the sun rising higher. Hours later, Dante checked the view through a slit in the wall. He said they were nearing another port city, smaller and quieter than the others. They'd leave the train before it reached the station. They jumped down when the speed slowed near a curve. Gravel bit into her palms as she landed. He helped her up, brushed dirt from her sleeve. The city spread ahead, rows of faded buildings, smoke from factories hanging low. They walked until they found a cafe near the docks. The smell of coffee and oil drifted through open doors. Dante bought 2 cups and a newspaper. He read quietly, scanning the back pages. Anna noticed a small photograph near the bottom corner. Grainy, distant, but unmistakably him. The headline, in Italian, mentioned the Don presumed alive. She froze. He followed her gaze, eyes narrowing. Then he folded the paper and set it aside. He told her that the hunt had officially begun. She said they could still keep running. He said they would, but from now on every shadow would be listening. They left the cafe and moved through narrow streets that smelled of salt and fish. The harbor came into view, boats rocking gently, ropes creaking. Dante stopped beside a small vessel, spoke briefly to an old fisherman, and handed him a wad of cash. The man nodded and began preparing the boat. Dante told her they'd cross the channel to a smaller island, unregistered and half forgotten. He said it would buy them a few days. On the boat, the sea was calmer than before, but the air carried a sense of something waiting. The island appeared as a blur of cliffs and green. As they approached, Dante pointed to an inlet hidden between rocks. They anchored there and climbed ashore. A narrow path led them to a cluster of empty cottages. He chose one near the water, door half hanging from its hinges. Inside, dust covered everything. Yet it felt like shelter. He said they'd stay until the next storm passed. She asked if he meant the weather or the men hunting them. He said both. That night the wind rose again. The walls shook, the sea howled beyond the cliffs. They sat near the fireplace, a single candle between them. Anna told him about her mother's garden, how she used to hide there after arguments with her father, counting the petals of each flower as if numbers could make sense of pain. Dante listened quietly. When she fell silent, he said his mother used to tell him that love and danger were born in the same cradle. They just learned to walk different paths. The candle flickered. The room seemed smaller, warmer. She met his eyes and felt the pull of something inevitable, as if the chaos outside existed only to push them toward this moment. He looked away first, exhaling slowly. He said they should rest. Tomorrow would bring choices neither of them wanted to make. She nodded, though sleep felt far away. When she finally lay down, the storm outside sounded almost like breathing. For the first time, she realized she no longer felt alone. Morning came with light that felt almost too gentle for the world they had survived. The sea lay flat and shining, as if the storm had never been. Anna woke to the sound of gulls crying above the cliffs and the faint hiss of waves slipping across stone. For the first time in days, her body did not ache from fear. Dante was already outside, standing near the edge of the shore, his figure cut against the sky. He looked carved from the same stillness as the rocks around him. When she joined him, he didn't turn immediately. He said that storms always left the air too clean, that it made danger easier to smell. She asked if he thought anyone would find them here. He said not quickly, but every map ended somewhere, and Marco had learned to follow the edges. They spent the day repairing what the wind had broken. The shutters, the door, the small hearth. Felt almost domestic, almost human. When she laughed once at the sight of him cursing softly as he hammered a bent nail. He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face like sunlight on water. In the afternoon, they walked along the beach. The sand was coarse and glittered with fragments of shells. Dante showed her how to tell when a tide was turning by the direction of the foam. She told him about the first time she'd seen the ocean, how Daniel had stood beside her, arm around her shoulders, telling her where she could and couldn't swim. Dante said quietly that the sea didn't belong to anyone. She said she wished she had known that then. When the sun began to fall, they found an old stone bench near the cliff edge and sat together. The wind smelled of salt and grass. Dante said that, in another life, he might have built a house somewhere like this. She asked if he would have built it alone. He looked at her then, and the answer hung between them. Unspoken but alive that night, the peace felt too still. The wind carried the creak of boats somewhere offshore, though they hadn't seen any by day. Dante's unease grew, subtle but constant. He checked the perimeter twice, then told her to keep a flashlight and stay near the back door if anything happened. She asked how he could tell danger was coming. He said sometimes it wasn't something you felt, it was what you stopped feeling. When she finally slept, her dreams were softer, not of Daniel's rage but of open roads and the sea. She woke before dawn to find Dante gone. Panic surged until she saw his silhouette by the shore, talking to someone. She crept closer, heart pounding. The man he spoke with was the fisherman who had brought them to the island. His boat bobbed near the rocks. She couldn't hear their words, but the fisherman's gestures were sharp, nervous. Dante handed him something, a wad of bills, and the man nodded before pushing off into the fog. When Dante returned, she asked what that was about. He said it was nothing, just payment for the crossing. But his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before, the thin note of someone lying to protect rather than deceive. The day passed quietly. They explored deeper inland, finding the remnants of an old fort overgrown with vines. The air was heavy with the scent of wild rosemary and salt. Anna felt a strange calm settle in her, a peace that frightened her because it felt like hope. They ate dinner beside the fire, canned soup heated in a dented pot. The flames painted gold across Dante's scar. She asked him if he had ever wanted to leave the life he'd been born into. He said yes, once, but leaving the kind of family he had meant erasing every trace of who you were, and he hadn't known who he was without the blood. She said she thought people could start over. He said maybe she was proof of that. Later, when he thought she was asleep, he sat by the window with a map spread across his knees. His fingers traced lines along the coast, pausing now and then as if remembering old routes outside. A boat's engine murmured through the fog. It came too close to the shore, paused, then moved away. Dante froze, listening. The sound vanished, but the calm of the day did not return when Anna stirred. He told her nothing was wrong, but she could see it in his eyes. The same tension that came before every storm. The next morning, the island's peace began to crack. A gull cried once, sharp and high, and Dante's head lifted instantly. He stepped outside without a word, scanning the horizon. The sea was empty, but his hand hovered near his jacket pocket where the pistol rested. Anna joined him. The air felt different, thicker, waiting. He said a fisherman's buoy had washed ashore during the night. It shouldn't have been there. Currents didn't run that way. Someone had anchored it deliberately. A signal, maybe a marker. She said it could have drifted. He told her tides never drifted without purpose. They spent the day packing what little they owned. Food, maps, spare clothes. Dante filled a metal canister with fuel from the cottage's generator. His movements were quick, efficient, silent. The calm in his face was gone. By afternoon the wind had turned east, carrying mist up from the water. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. Dante led her toward the cliffs where the path descended to the small inlet. He said they'd take the boat, cross to the mainland before sunset. When they reached the shore, the boat was gone. The rope had been cut clean through. Anna's breath hitched. Dante crouched, touching the frayed end of the rope. The fibers were still damp, sliced by a sharp blade. He said the fisherman had sold them out. He said it without anger, just weary certainty. He looked toward the horizon where fog thickened like smoke. Then he told her to run, to the northern cliffs, through the woods. He'd find another way. She refused. He grabbed her arm, his voice low but fierce, telling her that if she stayed, she'd die for a life that wasn't hers to lose. She pulled away and said she'd rather die beside him than hide waiting to be found. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled, the tension leaving him like breath leaving a wound. He said fine, but she'd follow his lead. They moved along the cliff path, keeping low under the trees. Behind them, faint shapes appeared through the fog. 2 boats, maybe 3, their engines cutting and starting again like distant thunder. Dante led her toward the ruins of the fort they'd found the day before. He said its tunnels might still be intact. They slipped inside just as voices echoed from the beach below. The tunnels smelled of salt and stone. Their flashlights carved narrow paths of light through the dark. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop sounding like a countdown. They reached a chamber that opened toward the sea through a collapsed wall. Dante crouched beside the rocks, watching through the gap. He counted 3 boats, 8 men. Marco wasn't visible, but Dante said he'd be there. He always was, waiting for the moment his enemies stopped believing in ghosts. Anna asked what they'd do. He said they'd make the island smaller. She didn't understand until she saw what he was holding, a flare and the fuel canister. She shook her head. He said quietly that some things didn't end until you burned what made them real. He told her to go deeper into the tunnel, to wait until she heard the second explosion, then to run north along the cliffs. She said she wouldn't leave him again. He said she would, because one of them had to live to tell the story before she could argue. He pressed the small gold ring into her palm, the same one he'd once shown her in the farmhouse. He told her his mother used to say love was proof that even sinners could be clean for a moment. He said she was that proof. Then he was gone, a shadow melting into the storm. She waited in the dark, every heartbeat a drumbeat of fear. Outside, engines roared and voices shouted. Then came the first explosion, a thunderclap that tore the air apart. The ground trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. A second later, another blast answered, closer this time. Heat rolled through the tunnel, followed by the sound of waves collapsing against stone. Anna ran, stumbling through smoke and debris. She burst out onto the northern cliffs, coughing, the world around her blurred by fog and flame. The beach below burned. Boats overturned, fire crawling across fuel-slicked water. She screamed his name, but the sea swallowed the sound. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw him. A figure moving through smoke, dragging another man before collapsing into the surf. Then the mist closed, and he was gone. She fell to her knees, clutching the ring. The metal was warm, pulsing with the echo of his touch. When dawn came, the fires were out. The island was silent again. the sea flat and innocent. She waited until the tide rose high enough to erase every footprint from the shore. Then she turned away, walking toward the cliffs where a path led down to the open sea. Somewhere behind her, waves hissed over blackened rocks, whispering a name the wind refused to keep. When Anna reached the mainland, the world felt hollow, as if the island had taken something living with it. A fishing trawler found her drifting in a dinghy that must have broken free from the fire. She barely remembered climbing aboard. Only the cold, the ache in her hands, and the ring clutched so tightly it had left a mark. The fishermen spoke little English. They left her in a harbor town built on stone and salt, the kind of place where strangers asked no questions. She walked until her legs refused, then found a cheap boarding house and slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, the television in the corner flickered with morning news. The images were blurry, the sound thin. An explosion on an unnamed island, a story about smuggling routes and an unidentified survivor. Then, almost hidden in the scrolling text, 2 words that froze her heart. Don Di Luca da Dante's name. Not spoken, but implied in the way the reporter hesitated, in the mention of an Italian fugitive long presumed dead. Anna turned off the set and sat very still. She wanted to believe he had died in the blast. It was easier than thinking he was somewhere out there bleeding, hunted again. But some part of her, the stubborn, foolish part that had run from Daniel into the arms of a stranger, refused to mourn what she could not see. She spent the next days moving north as he'd taught her. Cash only, no patterns, no calls. The roads blurred into one long strip of gray. At night she dreamed of the sea and of a voice telling her that running only mattered if it led toward something beautiful. On the 4th evening, in a rain-slick station outside Florence, she saw him. He stood by the platform, coat collar raised, head lowered. The scar on his jaw caught the light just once before he turned away. She almost called out, but something stopped her. An instinct that the man she saw was not the one she had known on the island. He moved slower now, like someone carrying pain that hadn't healed. She followed him at a distance through the narrow streets until he entered a small chapel tucked between 2 crumbling buildings. She stepped inside moments later. Candles flickered along the walls. The air smelled of wax and rain. Dante knelt near the altar, hands clasped, head bowed. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp. He asked for forgiveness for surviving when better men had not. Anna whispered his name. He turned, disbelief flashing across his face, quickly replaced by something softer, more dangerous. Hoped. He told her she should have stayed away. She said she had tried. He smiled faintly and said he'd never been good at staying dead. They sat together in the back pew, silence stretching like breath between them. He told her the blast had killed Marco's men, but not Marco. The old rival had escaped by sea and would come looking again. Dante said he intended to finish what the fire had started. This time there would be no running. Anna said he didn't owe the world that fight anymore. He answered that men like Marco didn't stop. They had to be stopped. He reached for her hand, fingers cold but steady. He said she'd given him something he hadn't had in years. A reason that wasn't revenge. Then he asked her to promise that if he didn't return, she wouldn't follow. She didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. He stood, adjusting his coat, the movement slow from the wound hidden beneath his shirt. He said he had one last meeting, an exchange on the old docks that night. Anna followed anyway. The docks sprawled along the Arno like veins, slick with rain and oil. Lamps burned in uneven pools of light. Dante walked toward a warehouse at the far end. Anna kept to the shadows, heart pounding. Through a crack in the door she saw Marco waiting, a tall figure in a dark suit, smile sharp as glass. Around him, men with weapons stood like statues, their voices carried across the water. Marco taunted Dante for the fire, for the years wasted hiding. Dante said he'd stopped running the moment Marco chose to hurt people who didn't belong in their war. Marco laughed, raised his hand, and his men stepped forward. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the scene. The sound that followed was chaos. Boots scraping, shouts, the dull percussion of fists and metal. Anna pressed against the wall, every nerve screaming to move, to help, to do something. A single gunshot cracked through the night, then another. Silence rushed in after them. When she pushed open the door, The air smelled of gunpowder and rain. Marco lay on the ground, still. Dante stood a few steps away, one hand pressed against his side. He looked up when he heard her. His eyes were calm, too calm. He said it was over. She ran to him, caught him as his knees buckled. He told her it was nothing, just a scratch. The lie trembled in his voice. Rain fell harder, drumming against the tin roof. He said she had to leave before the police came. She shook her head, holding him tighter. He smiled then, the same quiet, tired smile he'd worn the first night in the car. He told her she'd been the light he hadn't known he needed. His hand slipped from hers. Still warm, the rain didn't stop. It came in sheets, washing blood and memory into the river. Anna held him, feeling his pulse flutter once, twice, and then weaken. She whispered his name, the sound almost lost in the downpour. He tried to speak again, but the words came out in fragments. Something about the sea, about how it always forgave what men couldn't. She told him to stay quiet, that help was coming, even though they both knew the truth. No one came for ghosts. Lights flared at the end of the dock. Police, or maybe Marco's remaining men. Panic surged. Anna looked around, desperate. Beside them, a small service boat was tied to the pier, half hidden by crates. She pulled him toward it, half carrying, half dragging. He tried to protest, but his strength was fading fast. She got him onto the deck, started the engine with trembling hands. The boat sputtered, then roared to life. Bullets struck the water behind them as she pushed the throttle forward. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and gray as they sped into the open sea. Dante leaned against the side, breathing shallow. He told her she didn't have to run anymore, that she could still go back, find peace. She said peace wasn't something the world gave. It was something you decided to keep. That he smiled faintly. The horizon broke with the first hint of dawn, a pale line cutting the dark. His eyes followed it as if memorizing the color. Then he said her name, soft and certain, and the sound of it in his voice was enough to make her believe that love might still matter, even at the edge of everything. He closed his eyes, his hand still wrapped around hers. She kept steering until the boat drifted beyond the city's shadow, until the water grew calm again. Hours later, she brought the boat ashore on a quiet stretch of beach. The world was silent except for the waves. She laid him there, his face peaceful, almost asleep. The ring he had given her glinted faintly in the growing light. She whispered a prayer she hadn't known she remembered, pressing her forehead to his. Then she stood, looked once more at the sea, and walked inland. The police would come. The story would spread. A man lost to the sea, a fugitive's last redemption. But she knew that whatever legend they told, it would never hold the truth. That beneath all the violence and running, two broken souls had found a moment of grace. Days passed before they found the abandoned boat drifting near the shore. The newspapers wrote of a woman seen walking along the coast at dawn, carrying a gold ring in her hand. Some said she threw it into the sea. Others said she wore it still. Anna never appeared again in any record. Some believed she left the country. Others whispered that she returned to the island and built a small cottage where the ruins once stood. But those who knew how stories worked, how love refused to die cleanly, believed something else. That one evening years later, a fisherman saw two figures standing together on the cliffs, looking out at the horizon as the tide came in. One tall, one slender, both still as stone. When he blinked, they were gone, and only footprints remained in the sand. A year later, the world had grown quieter. The kind of quiet that came after too many storms. Fragile, deliberate, earned. Anna lived in a small town on the northern coast, a place where cliffs met the sea and gulls cried over the harbor at dawn. The locals knew her as the woman who rented the cottage at the edge of the fields, the one who always walked to the shore at sunrise and wrote in a small, weathered notebook. She smiled easily, but there was something distant in her eyes, like someone still learning how to exist in sunlight. She worked at the town's library, restoring old books, cataloging stories that had outlived their tellers. The smell of paper and dust comforted her. Words didn't shout or demand. They waited, patient, until she was ready to listen. Some days, when the light fell just right through the tall windows, she would think of the way Dante had once looked at the horizon, like a man trying to memorize a color before it vanished. The memory no longer hurt the way it used to. It had softened like sea glass smoothed by tide and time. The world believed Dante Di Luca was dead. The newspapers had written their versions of him. Fugitive, crime lord, smuggler, ghost. They never wrote about the man who had mended a broken shutter for her, who had learned to make soup taste like comfort, who had watched her sleep not out of possession but out of a kind of awe. Anna didn't correct them. She had learned that truth was sometimes safer left as legend. In her cottage, there was a small wooden box on the mantel. Inside it lay the gold ring, cleaned and shining again. Sometimes she wore it, not as a symbol of loss but of promise, the reminder that even in a world built on pain, love had found them for a moment. She wrote about him often, though she never used his name. In her notebook, he was the man from the sea, the ghost who remembered sunlight. Her words became stories of redemption, of men who found their hearts too late and women who learned that freedom didn't mean forgetting. Tea night. She would sit by the fire with a cup of tea and listen to the wind slide through the cracks in the walls. On certain nights, when the tide was high and the waves struck hard against the cliffs, she could almost hear another sound beneath the surf. A low hum, like an engine running far out at sea. She told herself it was imagination, but her heart always beat faster when she heard it. Spring came slowly to the coast. The air smelled of salt and new grass. Children played near the harbor, chasing kites made from paper and string. The world seemed determined to remind her that life went on, no matter who was missing from it. One morning, as she walked the shoreline, she saw something glinting among the rocks. It was a piece of metal, smooth and curved, like part of a watch face. She picked it up, brushed away the sand. There was a faint engraving on it. 2 letters. Till her breath caught. Could have been coincidence. Or it could have been a message carried by the sea. The same sea that had taken him. She closed her fingers around it and whispered his name, the way one speaks to memory rather than ghosts. That evening, the sky turned a bruised violet as rain threatened. Anna lit a lamp and sat by the window, notebook open but blank. She didn't need to write that night. The story already lived inside her, quiet and complete. Sometimes she wondered what Dante would have been like if life had been kind. She imagined him tending vines in a sunlit garden, hair streaked with gray, hands stained not with gunpowder but with soil. She imagined laughter instead of running, warmth instead of warning. But then she would remember the man as he was, the mixture of danger and grace, the way he had looked at her like she was something sacred. She would remember his last words, his hand closing around hers, the promise that love could be clean even when the world wasn't. Months passed. Tourists came and went, the sea never changing its rhythm. One afternoon, a letter arrived, postmarked from a coastal village across the channel. No return name, just a wax seal pressed with a faint outline of a rose. Inside was a single line written in Italian. Not all ghosts stay buried. No signature. She read it twice, then 3 times. The handwriting was familiar, steady, slanted, with the faint tremor of someone learning to write again after pain. She didn't tell anyone. She simply folded the paper, placed it in the box with a ring, and sat very still for a long time. That night, she walked to the cliffs. The wind was cool, the sea restless. Clouds moved like smoke across the stars. She stood there until her hair was wet with mist and her heart quieted. If he was alive, she thought, then he was where he belonged, somewhere between light and shadow, between memory and forgiveness. And if he was gone, then this was enough. The knowing, the loving, the surviving. She whispered into the wind. You found me once. That's enough. The tide answered with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh. When she turned back toward the cottage, she didn't look over her shoulder again. She didn't need to. Some stories didn't end. They simply folded into the sea, waiting to be told again by someone else brave enough to run, to love, to stay. And so the woman who had run from her husband, who had found freedom beside a man the world called a monster, kept walking. Each step carried her further into peace, and the waves behind her erased the rest.